I hung the jacket on the back of a chair when I got home, as I always did. The house was quiet, too quiet. You'd think after all these years I'd be used to that kind of silence, but it still sneaks up on you sometimes, like a cold draft under the door. I sat down at the kitchen table and poured the tea from the thermos into my old chipped mug. It was lukewarm now, but I drank it anyway. The smell of black tea and honey brought back memories that hit harder than I expected. That jacket wasn't just another piece of clothing. It was part of the story of how I raised my family, a sort of fabric witness to all the years that had passed. I bought it the year my grandson, Ethan, was born. My son and his wife were struggling back then, two young parents trying to make ends meet. I used to drive over every morning to drop off groceries, fix leaky faucets, mow their yard. That jacket was always on my back, no matter the weather. When Ethan got old enough to join soccer, I drove him to every practice. Rain, shine, didn't matter. The two of us had a ritual: he'd bring his soccer ball, I'd bring my thermos, and we'd talk about everything under the sun on the way there. He used to say, "Grandpa, you're my lucky jacket." I smiled every time he said it. There were rainy days when the fields turned to mud, and I'd still be there on the sidelines, soaked through but cheering. One time, he scored a goal in the last minute and came running to me after the whistle, grinning ear to ear. "See, Grandpa? You are lucky." That was years ago, before smartphones, before he started wearing headphones everywhere, before his voice changed and he stopped calling me Grandpa in front of his friends. I don't blame him for growing up. That's what kids do, they stretch out, test the world, forget the small things that held them steady. But hearing those words, "Everyone laughs," hit something deeper than I expected. I wasn't angry at him. Just sad. Sad because that old jacket was never about appearances. It was about everything I stood for: hard work, humility, showing up. When I lost my wife, that jacket carried the smell of her perfume for almost a year. When my son got divorced, it was what I wore when I helped him move his boxes into the new place. And when Ethan was little, it was what he curled up against when he fell asleep on my shoulder. You can't replace that kind of history with something new off the rack. I got up, walked to the chair, and ran my hand down the sleeve. The stitching was still strong, even if the color had faded. The fabric was worn, but solid, kind of like me, I suppose. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's face, the way he couldn't even look me in the eye. Not because he didn't love me, but because he was afraid of what others might think. That thought stayed with me all evening. When I sat down for dinner, it was there. When I washed the dishes, it followed me. By the time I turned off the lights and went to bed, I'd already made a quiet decision. If my jacket was a joke to some, then maybe it was time to remind the world what it really stood for. Not by arguing. Not by lecturing him. But by doing something good with it. The next morning, I folded the jacket neatly, set it beside the door, and wrote a small note on a piece of paper. For those who know, warmth comes from more than fabric. Then I opened my closet and started pulling out the rest: old sweaters, coats, scarves. Not because I wanted to prove a point, but because I suddenly realized how many people out there would give anything to have something that warm, no matter how it looked. By the time I was done, there was a pile big enough to fill the back of my truck. I poured myself another cup of tea, looked at the jacket one more time, and smiled. "All right, old friend," I said. "Looks like you've got one more job left to do. Before we start, tell me where you're from, and like this if you've ever had to remind family who you really are." When I got home that afternoon, I hung the jacket over the back of the kitchen chair, the same chair it had rested on for years after long days of work or cold mornings of coffee. The sleeves sagged a little, heavy with rain and memory. I made myself a cup of tea from the thermos I'd carried to Ethan's game. It was lukewarm now, but I drank it anyway. That jacket and that tea, they'd seen me through more storms than I could count. It wasn't just something I wore. It was the story of my life stitched into canvas and thread. I'd bought it the year my grandson was born, back when I still worked long shifts at the auto shop. It was sturdy, weatherproof, built to last. That jacket saw every mile I drove to pick Ethan up from school, every grocery run I made for my son when he was struggling to keep things together. It was what I wore the first time Ethan kicked a soccer ball, the first time he fell asleep in the truck on the way home from practice, his head resting against my shoulder. To me, that jacket wasn't old. It was seasoned. It had earned its scuffs and stains the same way I had. But to Ethan, it was a relic, something that didn't fit in his world anymore. I could almost understand it. Kids want to belong, and sometimes that means pushing away the things that made them feel safe when they were small. Still, hearing him say those words, "everyone laughs," cut deeper than I expected. After dinner, I sat with the jacket in my lap. I ran my fingers along the seams Helen had once mended for me. She used to tease me for never buying new things. "You'll wear that coat till it falls apart," she'd say. Maybe, I'd tell her, but it's still got work left in it. I smiled at that memory. She always understood that my way of loving people was through use, through what my hands could fix or carry or build. That night, before going to bed, I took the jacket to the porch and shook off the dust. The air smelled like rain. I thought about Ethan, about how far apart our world seemed now, his full of noise and screens, mine full of silence and things that last. But as I looked at that jacket, I realized something. Maybe it was time to stop wishing he understood what it meant to me, and start showing him what it could mean to others. Because care, like warmth, doesn't fade, it just changes who it reaches. The next morning, the jacket was still hanging on the back of the chair, just where I'd left it. Sunlight came through the window and hit the fabric in a way that made every thread, every faded crease, stand out like the lines on an old face that had seen too much to be ashamed of. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring at it. I kept thinking about Ethan, his eyes flicking away from me, the way he said, "everyone laughs." He wasn't cruel, he was just a boy trying to fit into a world that values shine over substance. But it hurt, still. I took the thermos off the counter. The tea inside had gone cold, so I emptied it into the sink, the sound echoing in the quiet house. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep feeling sorry for myself. The jacket didn't deserve to hang like some forgotten relic, and I didn't deserve to sit here waiting for a phone call that probably wouldn't come. So I did what I've always done when something breaks, I went to work. I took the jacket to the garage and started cleaning it up. I brushed off the dirt, sewed a loose button, even rubbed a bit of wax into the sleeves to make it weatherproof again. My hands shook a little, but I took my time. Every stitch felt like a small act of defiance, a reminder that usefulness doesn't fade just because the world forgets it. When I finished, I hung it by the door and looked at my coat rack, a row of old things that had outlived their owners. A few sweaters, an old scarf Helen had knitted, 2 coats that hadn't seen daylight in years. It hit me how much life we leave hanging in closets, gathering dust, when there are people out there freezing. That thought stuck with me all day. By evening, I had pulled every jacket, coat, and blanket I owned from the back of the closets. I laid them across the couch, counting them like treasures. Some were worn, sure, but all of them still worked, still warm, still capable of doing good. I packed them neatly into garbage bags, one after another, until the living room looked like a small donation center. When I stepped back, I noticed my old jacket still hanging by the door. For a second, I hesitated. That one meant something different. It wasn't just fabric. It was every late night, every promise kept, every drive through the rain to make sure someone got home safe. But maybe that's exactly why it needed to go too. So I folded it carefully, laid it on top of the others, and whispered, "One more job for you, old friend." The next day, I loaded up the truck. It felt good, like I was taking a step towards something instead of away from it. I drove to the community center downtown, the one that runs a shelter in the winter months. When I walked in with the bags, a woman at the desk looked up, surprised. "That's a lot of coats," she said. "Got tired of them sitting around, I told her. Figured someone could use them more than I could. She smiled and said, "You'd be surprised how many people show up without even a sweater." I helped her unload the bags. She pulled out my old jacket and ran her hands along the fabric. "This one's nice," she said. "Real sturdy." "It's got a lot of miles on it," I said quietly. "But it'll keep someone warm." As I left, she called after me, "We could use more people like you, sir." I smiled. There are more than you think. They're just waiting for a reason. Driving home, I rolled the window down and let the cold air hit my face. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel empty, it felt earned. That night, as I sat down with a cup of tea, I realized I hadn't lost something that day. I just passed it on. And maybe, just maybe, one day Ethan would understand that. Because sometimes the best way to teach love isn't by talking about it, it's by letting someone else wear it. It took a couple of days to gather everything together, not just from my house, but from the neighbors. Once I started telling folks what I was doing, people came out of the woodwork with donations. Old parkas, gloves missing their pairs, scarves tucked away in boxes marked, "Someday." Turns out, someday had finally arrived. I spent the week sorting it all. Every evening, my living room filled with piles of fabric, denim, flannel, fleece, each one carrying a story of the person who used to wear it. I mended buttons, stitched seams, and folded each piece like it still belonged to someone who mattered. When I dropped the first batch off at the community shelter, the woman behind the counter, her name was Marla, asked if I'd be willing to come back next week to help hand things out. "Some of our folks don't like trying things on," she said. "It helps when there's a friendly face." I told her I'd be there. That weekend, I stood by the tables in the shelter's rec room as people filed in. It was cold outside, the kind of cold that gets into your bones, but inside it smelled of soup and clean laundry. The volunteers were chatting softly, organizing the clothes by size. One man, maybe in his 40s, picked up a jacket that used to belong to my neighbor, a big guy named Carl. The man slipped it on and smiled. "Fits like it was made for me," he said. Another woman wrapped a faded blue scarf around her neck and said, "It's been years since I had something this warm." And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, my jacket. A young boy, no more than 12, stood holding it up to his shoulders. It was far too big for him, but he grinned anyway, spinning once in front of the mirror. "Warmest thing I've ever felt," he said. Marla caught my eye and smiled. "That one came from you, didn't it?" "Yeah," I said, my throat tightening. "That one's seen a lot of winters." She nodded. "Looks like it's got another one left in it." I stood there for a long moment, watching the boy zip it up. He looked so proud, like it was something brand new instead of something passed down. And for the first time since that day on the soccer field, I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt useful. Later, as we were cleaning up, Marla handed me a cup of coffee. "You know, we could use more donations like yours," she said. "People think old things aren't worth anything, but they're wrong. It's the old things that last." I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "They just need someone to remind them." That night, the local paper ran a short piece about the drive. I hadn't even known a reporter was there. The headline read, "Retired man donates over 300 warm garments to shelter." The photo showed me standing by the donation table, surrounded by coats, most of them still with small repair stitches from my living room. I didn't think much of it, but the next morning, the phone started ringing. People wanted to help. Churches, schools, even a couple of local stores reached out. Marla called me that afternoon. "Looks like you started something, Mr. Parker," she said. "I didn't start anything," I told her. "I just cleaned my closet." But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the clothes. It was about what they represented, the quiet, enduring warmth that comes from showing up for people, even when no one's looking. That night, I sat by the window, the newspaper open in front of me. The photo showed the jacket, my old, patched, embarrassing jacket, right there on the front table, zipped up and smiling on that young boy. I imagined Ethan seeing it someday. Maybe someone would show him the article. Maybe he'd recognize the jacket. Maybe he'd finally understand that the things we carry, the ones that look worn, old, outdated, are often the ones keeping others alive. I didn't want to guilt him. I didn't even want him to apologize. I just wanted him to see that what embarrasses one generation might just be what saves another. When I turned off the light and went to bed, I felt lighter somehow, like the jacket had taken with it all the weight I'd been carrying since that cold Saturday morning at the soccer field. And for the first time in a while, I slept easy. The following week, I went back to the shelter with another load of clothes. This time, I wasn't alone. People from the neighborhood had begun dropping things off at my house, coats, blankets, even shoes. They said, "You'll know where to take them." And so my porch became a small mountain of generosity, stitched together by the hands of strangers. Marla met me at the door again, shaking her head with a smile. "You're turning this into a full-time job, Mr. Parker." I chuckled. I've been retired long enough to get good at keeping busy. But it wasn't just busyness anymore. It was purpose. The newspaper story had spread farther than I expected. The small-town station picked it up, then a regional paper ran a feature. Within a week, boxes started arriving in the mail, some from people I'd never met, all with notes tucked inside. "This coat kept me warm through college, now it can keep someone else warm. My mom taught me to mend, not discard. She'd be proud of what you're doing." And then there was one letter, written in careful, almost childlike handwriting. "Dear Mr. Parker, I saw your story online. I live in Kansas, and my grandpa used to wear a jacket just like yours. He passed away last year, but he would have loved what you're doing. I hope this helps someone." Inside the box was a corduroy jacket, worn but soft, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and peppermint. I sat there for a while, holding it in my lap, thinking how kindness can travel further than we ever imagine, sometimes across states, sometimes across generations. That's when I got an idea. It wasn't a grand plan, more like a whisper that wouldn't leave me alone. What if we didn't stop at donations? What if we mended the clothes first, made them feel cared for again? That night, I dragged my old sewing machine out of the closet. The next day, I mentioned the idea to Marla. She loved it. Within a week, we'd gathered volunteers, mostly retired folks, a few teenagers doing community service hours, even a local tailor who offered to teach stitching techniques. We called it the Warmth Project. We met every Thursday in the shelter's rec room, turning it into a sea of fabric and chatter. The sound of sewing machines hummed alongside laughter. Coffee brewed in the corner. People swapped stories as they worked, stories about their lives, their families, their losses. And all the while, I wore my new jacket, not because I'd stopped missing my old one, but because I wanted to honor what it had started. Then one afternoon, Marla came rushing into the room with a newspaper in hand. "You won't believe this," she said. There it was on the front page of the Herald Chronicle. "Elderly man collects 300 garments, inspires community-wide movement." The article featured a photo of our sewing circle, smiling and surrounded by piles of clothes. In the corner, I could see the corduroy jacket from Kansas, freshly mended, ready to warm another back. I laughed and said, "Guess we're famous." Marla smiled. "Guess you're making it hard for people to ignore kindness." That night, I sat on the porch as the sun went down, the newspaper folded beside me. I thought about how a small moment of shame, a single comment about an old jacket, had turned into something that mattered. And yet, deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Because when something good starts to move in the world, it has a way of circling back to the people who need it most. Sure enough, the next morning, as I was sorting through another pile of donations, I heard a familiar voice from the driveway. "Grandpa?" I turned. There was Ethan, standing there, taller than I remembered, hands shoved in his hoodie pockets. "Hey, kiddo," I said, trying to sound casual. "Didn't expect to see you here." He looked down, then up again. "I saw the article. Everyone at school's talking about it." "Oh yeah?" He nodded. "They said you're the guy who gave away your jacket." He hesitated, then added quietly, "They think it's really cool." For a second, I couldn't speak. All I could do was smile, not the proud kind, but the soft kind, the kind that feels like forgiveness. He shuffled closer. "I brought you something." From behind his back, he held out a box, a brand new jacket. Navy blue. Sturdy. Warm. "So you won't get cold when you help people," he said, not meeting my eyes. I took it from him, the weight of it heavier than I expected. Not because of the fabric, but because of what it meant. "Thanks, Ethan," I said quietly. "But don't worry, the old one's still doing its job." He smiled a little. "Yeah, I know. That's kind of the point, right?" And just like that, the distance between us, the one that had stretched so painfully wide, began to close, thread by thread. It was a cold Sunday morning when Ethan came by again, this time unannounced. I was in the garage sorting through another batch of donated clothes, the smell of old fabric and detergent filling the air. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, that new jacket zipped up to his chin. He looked nervous, like someone who wanted to say something but wasn't sure where to start. "Got a minute?" he asked. "For you." "Always," I said, brushing off my hands. He walked in, eyes scanning the piles of coats and boxes around us. "You've really been doing all this, huh?" "Yep," I said. "Every week. People keep dropping things off faster than we can give them away." He nodded slowly. "I saw the new article. You're kind of a big deal now, Grandpa." I laughed. "If that's true, it's the first time being old and stubborn has paid off." He smiled faintly, but then his face grew serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Why didn't you tell me?" "About the donations, the shelter, everything. I had to find out from the newspaper." I hesitated before answering. "Because it wasn't about you, Ethan. It was about doing something good. Something quiet." He frowned. "But it started because of me." That stung a little, not because it was true, but because it came with guilt. He looked down, fiddling with the zipper on his jacket. "I said something stupid that day. I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I leaned against the workbench, watching him. "You meant it enough to say it, son. But I get it. You're a kid. You care what people think. I used to be like that too, believe it or not." He shook his head. "No, you don't get it. I wasn't just embarrassed because of your jacket. I was embarrassed because—" He trailed off. "Because what?" I asked gently. He sighed. "Because none of my friends have grandparents like you. They live in other states, or they're gone. You show up to every game, every event. And instead of being proud, I got scared they'd laugh at me for still having a grandpa who cared that much. I didn't expect that." For a moment, I just stared at him, this tall, nervous, almost grown kid who suddenly looked a lot like the little boy who used to run into my arms after every soccer game. "I wasn't trying to make fun of you," he said. "I just didn't know how to handle it." I nodded slowly. "That's the thing about growing up," I said. "It happens before you realize you've already started forgetting who helped you get there." He winced, and I immediately softened my tone. "But I'm not mad, Ethan. You needed to make your own way. I get that." He looked around again, his eyes landing on the box labeled children's coats. "I want to help," he said finally. "You sure?" He nodded. "You've done more with that one jacket than most people do with a lifetime. The least I can do is learn from it." That afternoon, we loaded up the truck together. We drove to the shelter, the same one that once held my old jacket on a table by the door. When we arrived, Marla smiled when she saw Ethan. "So this is the grandson I've heard about," she said. Ethan blushed. "Guess I've got a lot to live up to." "Oh, honey," she said, "you're already doing it just by being here." We spent the next few hours handing out coats and sorting boxes. Ethan was quiet at first, then more confident. He laughed with the kids, helped one boy zip up a coat too big for him, and carried boxes twice his size without complaint. At one point, he looked over at me and said, "You were right, Grandpa. This feels different." "Good different or bad different?" "Good," he said, smiling. "Like I'm actually doing something that matters." Before we left, Marla took a photo of the two of us, me with my coffee cup, him with his sleeves rolled up, both of us standing in front of a table of freshly folded jackets. That picture ended up in the next day's paper. The headline read, "3 generations of warmth, a family's gift brings a community together." When Ethan saw it, he laughed. "Guess I'm famous now too." "Not for the jacket, I hope," I teased. He shook his head. "No. For doing something that finally makes sense." Later, as we loaded the empty boxes into the truck, he looked at me and said, "Grandpa, I think your old jacket might actually be magic." "Magic?" I chuckled. "Yeah," he said. "It made people kinder." I looked out the window at the fading sunlight. "No, kiddo. People were always kind. They just needed something small to remind them of it." He thought for a moment, then said, "I guess that's what I needed too." We didn't say much after that. The hum of the road filled the silence, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, like a song that doesn't need lyrics. The next few months passed like the slow unfolding of spring, quiet, patient, full of small miracles. Ethan kept coming back to the shelter with me. At first, it was just on weekends, then after school. Before long, he was showing up on his own. He became a favorite there almost instantly. The kids adored him, especially the younger ones. He'd bring soccer balls, organize little games in the parking lot, and show them how to juggle the ball on their knees. "You're faster than me," he'd tell them, laughing, "but I've got better form." Marla started calling him Coach Ethan. I could tell he liked that. For me, watching him there, laughing, talking, helping without hesitation, felt like watching my old jacket come back to life. Every act of kindness he did was like another thread woven back into something that had once felt torn. One day, I arrived at the shelter to find him already there, sorting through a pile of donations. He'd made a sign that said, "Warm hands, warm hearts." "What's this?" I asked. He grinned. "A project. My school needed volunteer hours, so I got some classmates to help. We're collecting gloves and hats this winter." I smiled. "Looks like you caught the bug." He shrugged. "Guess it's contagious." He didn't say it, but I could see it in his face, the quiet pride, the sense of belonging. It wasn't about earning points or praise. He'd found purpose, the same way I had. A few weeks later, there was another article in the paper, this one written by a young journalist who'd been following our story since the first coat drive. The headline read, "Grandfather and Grandson Inspire Citywide Clothing Drive." The photo showed us side by side, him in his blue jacket, me in a flannel shirt, both smiling, surrounded by kids. When Ethan saw it, he laughed. "You realize we're becoming a brand, right?" I chuckled. "If kindness is the product, I'll take it." That weekend, we were invited to speak at a local community event. It wasn't anything fancy, just folding chairs in a school gym, a microphone that squeaked every time someone touched it. Ethan went first. He stood on stage, hands in his pockets, and said, "A few months ago, I told my grandpa not to wear an old jacket to my soccer game. I thought it embarrassed me. Turns out, I was the one who should have been embarrassed, not for what he wore, but for forgetting what it meant. The room was silent. You could have heard the air catch in people's throats. Then he smiled and said, "That jacket started something bigger than both of us. It taught me that warmth isn't about what you wear, it's about what you give." When he finished, people stood and clapped. I didn't move at first. I just watched him, this tall, confident young man, and thought of the little boy who once fell asleep on my shoulder after practice, my old jacket draped over him like a blanket. After the applause died down, he came back to his seat, grinning like a kid again. "You didn't tell me public speaking was this hard," he whispered. "You didn't tell me you'd make me cry," I whispered back. Later, when we got home, he helped me unload the truck. As we carried boxes inside, he said, "Grandpa, I think we should make next month's drive bigger, maybe get the whole town involved." "Whole town?" I said. "You think they'd go for that?" He smiled. "If we ask nicely." I looked at him and realized something. I hadn't just gotten my grandson back, I'd gotten a partner. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the last one standing from an old generation. I felt like part of a bridge, one made of fabric, patience, and love. It's been over a year since that day on the soccer field, the day Ethan looked at me and saw only an old jacket. Now, when I walk into the shelter, he's the one who waves me over with a grin. "Grandpa's here." The kids shout, running toward us with their coats half-zipped and their faces flushed from laughter. Every month, we host a clothing drive together. What started as a few boxes has turned into something bigger than either of us imagined. Local schools, small businesses, even the fire department pitch in now. The city put up a banner outside the shelter that reads, "The Warmth Project, because care never goes out of style." Ethan designed it himself. The funny thing is, I don't even own that old jacket anymore. It's somewhere out there, keeping a stranger warm, just as it was meant to. But in a way, I still carry it with me. It's in every handshake, every smile, every child who zips up a coat and whispers, "It's so warm." Ethan wears his blue jacket now when we work together, but sometimes, on cold mornings, I catch him putting on one of my old flannel shirts too. He says it's "for luck." I just smile and don't say anything. One afternoon, after another long day at the shelter, we sat on the curb outside, sharing a thermos of tea. He took a sip, grinned, and said, "You know, Grandpa, I think your jacket was kind of magic." "Magic?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "It didn't just keep people warm, it changed how they saw things. It changed me." I looked at him, older now, steadier, a young man with the same eyes that once looked up at me from the back seat of my truck. "No," I said. "You changed yourself. The jacket just gave you something to start with." He nodded, smiling softly. "Still, I think you should know. I'm proud of you." Those words, simple as they were, landed heavier than any applause or headline ever could. When we stood to leave, I watched him carry a box of donated coats to the truck, shoulders strong, head high. For the first time, I realized the truth, I hadn't passed down an old jacket. I'd passed down a way of living. Now, every time he zips up his coat, he carries a little of that story forward, the one about a man who once embarrassed his grandson, and taught him that love, like warmth, doesn't fade. It just finds new hands to hold it.